All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words, written in the Declaration of Independence of the United States, stood as a powerful statement of the rights of all people, yet in the years that followed, racism persisted, and people forgot that the Declaration had prohibited the violation of these unalienable rights. Black people remained slaves on plantations and continued to be oppressed by white people. Could racism be powerful enough to shape values about life and liberty to address racism and protect these public values? People turned to the power of biology and evolution. Racism and the way it borrowed the hand of evolution to emerge. Classification could begin from territories under colonial regimes, the maritime expansion of many empires, and the establishment of colonies, especially in Africa, allowed European nations to assert their influence there. It began simply with small traders along the African coast. Gradually, Europeans began to push inland and establish control through colonial regimes and the formation of territories. These colonies were initially just places to extract resources and ship goods back to the mother country. Colonialism flourished and developed strongly in Africa, reaching its peak during the scramble for Africa. One of the systems that colonialism spread across Africa was the slave trade. It emerged as part of the colonial expansion in Africa and the discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1490. The countries soon followed to the newly discovered New World. Spain established its first colony in 1490, followed by England in 1497, Portugal in 1500, and France in 1605. However, the colonization of the Americas faced considerable resistance from native tribes, but resistance was futile against those with guns and cannons. As a result, pre-Columbian peoples mostly faded into history. The rest were driven from their lands by European settlers, their estates destroyed or overtaken, and the spread of diseases from Europeans devastated populations, leaving behind lands and a massive labor demand that colonial powers had to address. How would the labor demand be resolved? Europeans were not suited to the tropical climate of South America. Their bodies were not adapted to live or work there, and besides, wages would be high. Meanwhile, Africans were perfectly suited. They lived in tropical regions, were adapted to the climate, and most importantly, their labor was cheap. Because no one had money anyway, the demand for black labor on coffee plantations increased, which in turn increased the demand for a system to promote the slave trade, turning Africans into commodities who were captured and transported to the Americas. A black slave cost only about 70 to 100 francs, but could sell for 1,000 to 2,000 francs, a profit margin attractive enough to send ships across the Atlantic. Ocean revenue, quantity, and profit drove the slave trade to grow more aggressive. An expanse of more and more slaves were shipped out upon arrival in the Americas. African individuals, stripped of their rights, became property of the plantation owners, losing their freedom, their right to live and pursue happiness naturally. The same applied to their children. Over time, Africans were said to carry what was called a slave bloodline. Black people came to be seen as biologically closer to slavery. Unlike the white bloodline, which was regarded as superior in race and capability, this idea and perspective were fundamentally baseless, merely a justification used by empires to claim superiority and spread so-called civilization to those deemed biologically inferior and less civilized than white people. Views on white superiority over other races created a hierarchy of racial groups. Within this social structure, white people were assumed by biological advantage to deserve better benefits and rights. It was like how society today accepts that the rich naturally get better health care, their children go to better schools, and they live in larger homes because they are believed to be smarter, harder working, and more talented. Racism emerged in that way. It began simply with an idea of division and genetic superiority, yet at that time, there was no real evidence that white people were truly superior. The belief rested on the idea that they dominated black people and treated them as property, including their descendants, while selling the illusion of justice and fairness to protect their position. Europeans relied on genetics and arguments claiming that black people were born to be slaves and that their status in society should not be altered, of course applying the same logic to their children. Therefore, to construct racial categorization, three things were needed. One, a racial hierarchy, to views on race and differences, with one group superior and another inferior, and three, widespread acceptance of these tribalist beliefs. Chemical theory shaking hands with racism. Everyone still remembers Hitler, and the old man right. Hitler's Nazi party was rooted in nationalism, as it claimed that the Aryan race was the highest form of evolution and deserved to be placed at the top of the hierarchy and allowed to rule once again the idea of a social structure. They believed the Aryan race was superior and exceptional, thus needed to be preserved and protected from degeneration, especially from Slavs, Jews, and Roma. Hitler's ideology at that time was essentially similar to those in countries like the United States or Britain, where those belonging to higher races, particularly Aryans and whites, were given privileges, and the belief in superiority, intelligence, and moral excellence naturally followed. Of course, those countries implemented measures to protect those values by complicating immigration procedures, but those were still relatively soft measures. The story became far more intense when Hitler interpreted Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. Only individuals who adapted well would survive, persist, and reproduce. In Hitler's view, granting individual freedom, as in capitalism or fairness in socialism, was equivalent to helping the weak and allowing those unfit to survive. Thus, he claimed a biological basis to filter out the flawed. Gradually, society would be overwhelmed by defective individuals. Therefore, Hitler and his party assumed a mission to protect humanity. And you know what happened next. Welcome to the Holocaust server. Hitler's genocidal thinking, under the pretense of protecting humanity, was later rejected for being extremely radical and heavily racialized. It has been over 70 years since World War II, and Hitler's idea of evolutionary humanism has become a cautionary tale. Even as advancements aimed to upgrade humankind emerged in the years that followed, a battle arose between capitalism, with its values of individual freedom, and socialism, with its values of justice and equality. Today, racism has decreased and now appears more in the perspectives of individual races, and often stems from hostility among groups. In recent times, racism has gradually shifted toward cultural discrimination, and the target has moved from Black people to Muslims. Ultimately, in the future, with the increasing stratification between rich and poor, discrimination may not be based on race or culture, but on wealth and biology. The medical world is rapidly advancing and applying more technology to human development, with consultations to create superior superhumans. At that point, we might not only have a dominant class based on belief, but a truly superior class in intelligence and health, as medicine begins to create enhanced individuals, which will be dangerous if accessible only to the wealthy.